Well, everybody hear me okay? I was told a student would introduce me. I wasn't told that he would make better remarks than I will. So I have to start all over again here. Actually, it's a real pleasure to be back here. I visited this extraordinary complex here when it was first being built. Skip Rutherford was in charge. He was not dean back then, and he showed me around, and it's just fantastic. And not least because of the emphasis on public service, which I think is really disappearing, that ideal from our politics. And it's also a pleasure to be, this is the first thing I'll say that may surprise you, but it's in my book, in the great compound created by the president, I think was actually one of the great conservatives in modern American history, and that's Bill Clinton. And I'll tell you why I think he was. And then maybe I'll be able to convey what my little book is about. And by the way, it's a narrative. There's an argument in it, but it's really a story. It's a story about the origins, the rise, the triumph, the glories, and then the decline of modern conservatism. And so there are a lot of people in it, and there are some ideas, there are presidents and also thinkers and writers, many of whom are not much remembered today, but who really created this great movement before it came apart in just the way that Nathaniel has described. But here's why I think Bill Clinton was a great conservative. It's not to say he was a Republican, obviously he was not. But here's what happened. If we remember the election of 1992, which feels like yesterday to me. It's a little shocking to see this strapping young guy say he was 7 years old when it happened. But let's go back and look at that election a little bit, because I describe it in the beginning of my book. Bill Clinton won, as we know, in 1992 with 43% of the vote, which was not a majority. It was the same percentage that Richard Nixon actually had gotten in 1968. It's not an unheard of plurality, but it was not a majority. He actually won, we sometimes forget, a bigger share of the Electoral College than Barack Obama did. He got 370 electoral votes as opposed to 364 or 365. More important still, remember there was a third-party candidate, Ross Perot, and that's what threw all the popular totals out of whack. It was one of the strongest third-party challenges in American history. But here's the important thing. The defeated incumbent, George H.W. Bush, got a smaller share of the vote, the popular vote, than Herbert Hoover got in 1932 when Franklin Roosevelt was elected. So by any normal measure, that would have seemed a very profound repudiation of the politics that had preceded, right? No matter what party you're in, just in terms of the numbers. And of course, that politics was 3 successive Republican presidencies, Ronald Reagan's 2 elections, and then George Bush the Elder's. So in the 1980s, the only presidents elected were Republicans, just as in the 1930s and 40s. 2 entire decades, the only presidents we had were Democratic. So Bill Clinton took office, and in fact, at the very end of the campaign, he had compared George Bush to Herbert Hoover because the economy was in bad shape. We're in the midst of a recession, not like the one we're now inching out of, but a fairly serious recession. And the Census Bureau had released poverty figures that showed they were greater. The sheer number of poor people was greater than at any time since 1964, when Lyndon Johnson had begun his war on poverty. So Bill Clinton came into office with what, at the time, seemed a somewhat ambitious stimulus package. It's so funny to think of the numbers compared to what we've just seen. Anybody remember how big it was in its first presentation? $19.5 billion. About 1/40th of what Barack Obama presented and was enacted into law by Congress. And what happened was, at that moment, something that had no precedent in American politics. The Senate Minority Leader, the top Republican, Bob Dole, said, well, Bill Clinton won, but he didn't get a majority of the vote. So the country hasn't really spoken. And I am here, Bob Dole, to uphold the principles of my side, the Republicans, and we don't believe in the stimulus package. Well, Clinton's majority, the Democratic majority in both chambers of Congress, the House and the Senate, were just about what they are now for Barack Obama. The numbers were almost identical. I think it was maybe 57 Democratic senators, and now we're at 59. Very close. House somewhat similar. And so you would think that despite some grumbling, the stimulus package, small though it was, well, partly because it was so small, would be approved. Anyone remember what happened instead? Bob Dole used the filibuster 4 times in a row to stop it. Now, there's a long history, and usually not a very attractive or happy history in our politics, of filibusters being used, usually by very powerful Southern senators who wanted to stop civil rights legislation. But there was no precedent for a president of the United States who'd been popularly elected coming into office and presenting a fairly commonplace legislative item and being defeated by the use of the filibuster. So a very knowledgeable, nonpartisan observer and scholar of American politics, a guy named Alan Ehrenholt, who's the editor of Governing magazine, which is really a magazine for working politicians. It shows them how governing works, how you achieve your goals, how bureaucracies work, and all the rest. There's no policy or there's no politics to it at all. Alan Ehrenholt looked back during the Clinton impeachment, and in 1999, it was actually an article he wrote for my colleagues and me at the op-ed page where I used to work as an editor. He said this was the beginning of the end, because the traditions, the legislative traditions of this country were violated at that first moment. And then, of course, it carried through into the impeachment and all the rest. Well, but here's the interesting thing about all that, is that the Republicans, in economic terms, actually were right. That is to say, we were not in the depths of a recession, we were coming out of a recession cycle. And we probably didn't really need the economic stimulus that President Clinton had proposed. And in fact, the first and most important person to acknowledge that was President Clinton himself. So he adjusted course in his presidency. Remember that the dirty word at the time was triangulation. You know what the word for triangulation used to be? Statesmanship. He saw where the public was, he saw what the public wanted, he saw where the economy was, he also saw that market forces had been unleashed by his predecessors. And even if his own inclination was to be a John F. Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson-style Democrat who would enlarge the government and create more social services, he saw the country wasn't there. So what did Bill Clinton do? He set his ideology aside. He governed from the center, and he listened. You know, we forget one of the great attributes of statesmen is their ability to hear what other people say. The great political philosopher Hannah Arendt, many years ago in an essay on Socrates, said, if you look closely at the foundations of democracy, you see the best leaders that have one attribute above all. They're able to listen to other people. And that doesn't mean they just fall silent while the other person talks. It means they actually get inside the head of other people. So if to any of you who have not listened to the audio tape of Barack Obama's Dreams from My Father, I recommend you do it. Has anybody heard it? He imitates all the voices. He does his white grandfather, the Kansan. He does the guy calling from Kenya at the beginning to tell him his father has died. He does kind of hip-hop African Americans. He does his professors in college. That he has a great ear. This is what we don't have in our politics now, is the capacity to listen. One reason I wrote this book was because of the greatest of modern political orations, which was Barack Obama's speech on race in Philadelphia. It wasn't just what he said about African Americans, it was the way he was able to get inside the heads of the white people he talked about. Remember what he said? That many Americans, many white Americans are the children of immigrants, or immigrants themselves, and you can't make the case to them that they're responsible for slavery and Jim Crow, because they had nothing to do with it. And when I heard him say that, I wondered, why is it that this very liberal political figure understands conservative arguments and honors them better than I hear any conservative thinker or political figure honor the arguments made by liberals? And so that's what got, because Nathaniel's quite right. I've been writing in the topic of conservatism and reading in it mainly, which is the most important thing. That's how you learn, for some 20 years now. And it seemed to me we had reached a point where conservatism as a serious philosophy, not as a kind of cultural warfare, had ended. So I want to talk about a couple of moments described in this book where conservatism proved that it could be a great philosophy, and when it contributed something to our society, something I think, it contributed things we don't see now. One of them came in the mid-1960s. It was really in 1967 and 68, and I'm glad to see there are some people in this room who will remember that horrific year. 2 political assassinations, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. Riots in both convention cities, the Democrats in Chicago, the Republicans in Miami. After Dr. King's assassination, there were some 1,000 cities in America had some form of urban unrest. The country looked like it was coming apart. In April of 1960, or March of 1968, Lyndon Johnson, who had been elected one of the greatest landslides ever, 60% of the vote in 1964, and was losing popularity because of the war in Vietnam, which he was unable to manage. But he was still the front runner to be reelected in 1968. There was no really strong Republican challenger just yet. There were several fighting. Nixon was one, George Romney, a lot of the moderate Republicans, who, by the way, don't exist anymore today, but who dominated the Republican Party back then. But then Johnson's challenge came from within. It came from within his own party. And if you look back at the historical record, you'll see almost any time an incumbent faces a strong challenge within his own party, he will lose in the general election. It happened to Gerald Ford in 1976. It happened to George H.W. Bush in 1992 when Patrick Buchanan challenged him. It happened to Jimmy Carter in 1980 when Edward Kennedy challenged him. So Eugene McCarthy, who was an anti-war Democrat, very brilliant man from Minnesota, talented politician, who had declared a kind of internal war. He was part of the Dump Johnson movement, the Democratic Party. In fact, the organizers of that movement had drafted him to run. They couldn't find a politician, and Eugene McCarthy agreed to do it. Robert Kennedy was on the fence. He couldn't decide whether to run. He opposed the war in Vietnam, too. So Eugene McCarthy entered the New Hampshire primary by the seat of his pants, and came within 5 or 7 percentage points of defeating Lyndon Johnson. Sometimes people remember that McCarthy won, but he didn't. Johnson won the primary, but it was very close. A few days later, Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election because he had been challenged so forcefully from within. This was a moment, if you were an ideological conservative, to say, yes, we got rid of the guy. We got rid of the president. The president's out. The party's coming apart. This looks good for us in 1968, the approaching election. But the greatest conservative intellectual of his time, William F. Buckley Jr., said just the opposite. He wrote a column, then syndicated in 300 newspapers, back in the days when there were 300 newspapers to syndicate them in. And he said, you know, this may look like a moment for jubilation, because he said, I don't like Lyndon Johnson. In fact, he disliked Johnson probably more than any president of his time, because he built the government up larger than any other had. He's the author of The Great Society. Everything Bill Buckley as an ideological conservative opposed. He said, but you know, if you're a true conservative like me, you believe in our political process, and you believe the office of the presidency actually deserves some respect and honor. And he says, it's a little unsettling when a few carloads of students can drive across the border from Massachusetts, most of whom, when they are polled, don't even know what Eugene McCarthy's positions are on the big issues, including the Vietnam War, and essentially take down a sitting president. He said, that is not the way our democracy is supposed to work. And then he wrote a series of columns defending Lyndon Johnson. Why? Because protesters, anti-war protesters, were calling him a murderer. And Buckley said, I don't like Johnson. I don't agree with everything he does. But when you start insulting his person and not his politics, you're actually degrading our democracy. And, he said, these critics are doing it in the name of humanity. In the name of humanity, they're calling him a murderer of babies in Vietnam. He said, this is a problem for our politics. I ask you now, what conservative intellectual, set the politicians aside. They do something different, though we can get to them in question period maybe. What conservative writer or thinker that you're, or television host, or talk radio impresario is saying anything like that today? Maybe someone is, but I haven't heard it. Now I want to give you one other example from that same period. Just a year before, 1967, the great Democratic senator, though he was not a senator yet, he was a policy wonk, a brilliant policy wonk, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, spoke before the most important liberal political advocacy group then in America, the Americans for Democratic Action, the ADA. And Moynihan, who had worked for both Kennedy and Johnson as a policy guru, actually the architect of the Great Society and some of the New Frontier programs, had been disillusioned when his Great Society program that would have helped, he thought, inner city families grow stronger and receive economic benefits in the society they were not getting. Because all the civil rights legislation had been passed by now, the major civil rights legislation, 64 and 65. Moynihan said, now there's another problem, and it's not it's not a social justice problem, it's an economic justice problem. And Lyndon Johnson was completely on board with him and gave a very famous speech, some of you may remember, at Howard University in Washington. It was called To Fulfill These Rights. I'll tell you how politics has changed. The first line of that address by Lyndon Johnson was, quote, "The earth is the home of revolution," unquote. That's how politics looked in that period. So the war on poverty began, and then Moynihan and many others noticed something was going on, that even as the programs were going forward, and America at that time was very prosperous, unemployment was 4.5%, less than half what it is today. The GNP, as they used to call it, the gross national product, now we call it the GDP, had increased 8% in a single year, and the Federal Budget Office predicted a surplus over the next few years of $45 billion. A lot of money back then, more than 40 years ago. So the country was rich. And Johnson and Moynihan said, it's unfair that a country this rich has so many people falling behind, so we're going to do something about it. Well, then what happens? The same series of events I mentioned before. There was a terrible, disastrous riot in Watts in Los Angeles, which had been considered, it had been judged by the National Urban League as the most hospitable urban zone in all of America, and that somehow it went up in flames. And then in 1967, right before Moynihan made his address, there were uprisings as well in Detroit and in Newark, two cities that never would recover from them. And so Moynihan addressed his liberal group, and he said, you know, we as liberal Democrats can't blame the other side for what's gone wrong. So, however well-intentioned our programs were, and however right they may be, we have been in office during this period, and maybe we have to change our emphasis a little bit. And what our government should be about, maybe, is not so much the expansion of public services and the increase of rights. We've done a lot of that. Instead, what we need to do is find Republicans, responsible Republicans, who will join with us to help create what Moynihan called the politics of stability, that the time for restoring order of some kind had come. So my guy, William Buckley, follows this speech, which was printed on page 1 of the New York Times, because it was so shocking to see a famous liberal Democrat, putting the challenge to his own party, something we also don't see so much of in our politics today. And William Buckley wrote another great column about it, and it was titled The Politics of Stability. And again, here was his opportunity to say, Well, Moynihan just admitted we were right. I hate the Great Society more than anyone, and now this guy's saying pretty much the same thing. But Buckley was a more nuanced thinker than that. First of all, he knew Moynihan wasn't really saying that. Moynihan was saying conditions had changed and a new crisis was afoot, and all responsible people should try to solve it. And so Buckley then summarized Moynihan's remarks, and he said, you know, American liberalism faces a crisis. Liberals have to decide whether theirs is a workable governing philosophy or whether it's going to get pulled so far left that it can't contribute anything to our society. And then he has my single favorite line in my book. All my favorite lines are written by other people. Surprised being a journalist. He said, anything we conservatives can do to help, just holler. That is how our politics used to be conducted at the highest levels. There was an understanding that no matter what the ideological differences might be, that what governs this country is an idea, and maybe just a vision, maybe even utopian, of a consensus. Consensus derives from the Latin word census. It means you count the heads in the room. You see where most of them come together, and you say, that's what we do. Though you, as a leader, you let yourself be led. You let yourself be led by the will of the people. Now, it doesn't mean that you become a rubber stamp for every idea you hear. You don't take a poll for every single idea. You still have your governing philosophy, but you adjust pragmatically to the situation. I'll give you one more example of how this happened. Then I'd love to take questions, okay, because we're probably getting near the end of my period here, right? Also, Buckley again, 1967, one of the heroes of ideological conservatism had finally broken through and won a major office. Ronald Reagan had been elected governor of California in 1966 and had promised to slash the state's budget. Only once he actually got to Sacramento and saw what was in front of him, he realized that services were falling apart and he would actually have to increase the state budget more than any of his Democratic predecessors had ever done, which set off howls on the ideological right. They thought that Reagan was betraying them. The same thing would happen, by the way, when Reagan was president and negotiated an end to the Cold War with the Soviets, kept Medicare and Social Security in place when he spent most of his career criticizing them because he adjusted to the politics of the time. So Buckley wrote this is actually a longer essay in his great magazine, National Review, and he said, what exactly is Ronald Reagan supposed to do? Padlock the state treasury? Well, the interesting thing is that's what Reagan had said he was going to do. But once he had to govern, he accepted the responsibilities of his office. And Buckley said a really great thing. It's come up in some of the interviews I've done for this book. People have asked me about it. He said, rhetoric, people may say that Ronald Reagan is all rhetoric and that his policy is betraying the rhetoric. He said, actually, rhetoric is the principal thing in politics. Rhetoric precedes action. In other words, what you say you believe is not something to be held against you as a scorecard. It's an announcement of where you stand as a citizen and as a political figure, as a part of our governing philosophy. What are your views? Reagan's ideal views were to shrink the government, until he saw it wasn't practical to do it. So was he a liar for having done the right thing? No, he did what he needed to do. We have come through generations of politicians who govern this way. And in my book, I argue the two great modern conservative presidents, and in my view, the two very best presidents, were mirror images of one another, Dwight Eisenhower and Bill Clinton, because each one accepted the arguments the other side had made, took the measure of the population and said, we'll find a compromise and make it work. And you would hope we could achieve something like that today, but we seem a very long ways away from it. And I'll say one last thing about that. I was asked by great Steve Barnes when I did his program, who's the new William Buckley? Don't we need somebody like that? And I said, the answer to the second question is, of course we need someone like that. The answer to the first one is, I have no clue where he is. And I'll tell you why, same answer I gave him. There are some half-dozen really brilliant, thoughtful, conservative thinkers and writers in America. But they've all deserted the movement. My colleague David Brooks, who writes, I think, some of the best op-ed columns in the country, he was a movement conservative. He doesn't sound like one now. Anybody know Fareed Zakaria? the great foreign policy writer and Newsweek editor, he was a movement conservative. You wouldn't know it now. Or Francis Fukuyama, who wrote the book The End of History, he was the great foreign policy thinker for the neoconservatives. You wouldn't know it now. The blogger Andrew Sullivan, we all read, he was defending George Bush in his first term. He thought this was a great conservative president. He doesn't say it now. They've all been evicted or left of their own volition because their side will not accept their kind of nuanced, serious-minded, fair-minded argument. They don't want that. They want politics to be a form of warfare. And if you're not on the right side, what they call the bright line, in the line of battle, if you're on the wrong side, they don't want to hear from you. And that is what has damaged our politics on the right. Now, people say to me sometimes, this happened when I was in Washington, someone said, well, couldn't you write a book called The Death of Liberalism? I said, yes, I could, but it wouldn't be as interesting. Because for the last decades, it really is conservatism that's made us think the most. And that's what it's supposed to do now. It's supposed to participate in our public conversation, not to stand outside and deride the office of the presidency. Remember the protesters in Washington the other day? They didn't just attack Barack Obama. They attacked Republican and Democratic congressmen. Well, who do they think is going to run the country then? It can't be Rush Limbaugh. He wasn't elected at anything, you know, and it doesn't mean he doesn't have his role to play. But the leaders, and both political and intellectual on the right, have abandoned their role. They've turned it over. They don't want to do the hard work they used to do. And so I hope will happen in this little book is they'll see some of the history, because I cover some of the big thinkers and journalists and writers, and maybe they'll get a sense or remind them of what their own great movement used to be like, because it's better for all of us if we have that. Because if someone makes a very strong argument against you, then you have to make a better argument yourself to come back. That was the contribution Buckley made. That he made you, as a liberal, make a better argument back at him, and that raises the level of discourse. And that's what we're supposed to be as a civil society, the great term Edmund Burke used to describe England in his day, and that still applies to us here. So that's enough. Should we take some, Patrick, you want to get some questions in? Or?
We have 2 mics roaming around. If you would raise your hand, I'll point to you.
All right, we have these very speedy microphone deliverers here.
We'll start with you over there, sir, on the right.
What role, is it on?
Yes.
What role did you see Barry Goldwater play in the conservative movement?
Very important, great question, great question. We sometimes forget that Ronald Reagan was really the stepchild of Barry Goldwater. Goldwater did a number of enormously important things. First of all, he realigned the Republican Party when he ran in 1964. Because it was Goldwater who saw that the solid South could actually be brought into the Republican Party. It's an interesting point, too, because that strategy was first printed in the pages of National Review, not by Buckley, but by the magazine's publisher, William Rusher. Another example of how, in those days, intellectuals and political figures found common ground. So what Goldwater did was to move the base of the Republican Party from the North and Midwest to the Sun Belt and the South. So he gave us really the template for the Republican Party we have today. The other thing Goldwater did was absolutely to insist. First of all, he did not want to run in 1964. There really was a draft Goldwater movement. He had no interest, no egotistical interest in his own career. All he cared about were the causes that he was devoted to, maybe to an excess, because in some ways that made him less pragmatic than he might have been. But you'll all remember the Goldwater in his last years, who said, here's a classic case of how you really apply your principles. Remember, it was Barry Goldwater who testified before the Senate during the debate about admitting gays into the military. And Goldwater said, of course we have to do this, right? We want people who shoot straight. We don't care whether they're sexually straight. Because there was a homosexual in his own family. So he adapted again to the politics around him. He also never conducted politics on a personal level. Barry Goldwater. As it happens, my editor at Random House, Bob Loomis, also edited once a book by Barry Goldwater and one by Hubert Humphrey. Remember him, Hubert Humphrey? And he said whenever Humphrey came to town, he would come in with an entourage of all his minders and flax, and they would all sweep into the Random House offices. And then sometimes Bob Loomis would be sitting in his office and the phone would ring and someone on the other line would say, "Hi, it's Barry, do you want to have dinner tonight?" Very modest, none of the sort of imperial pretensions we saw in politics. You'll remember also it was Barry Goldwater who delivered the news to Richard Nixon during Watergate and said, "This is being taped, right? Can I say this anyway?" He said, "We can't drag your ass out of this crack. This one's gone too far. You have to go." So that, again, is the kind of politician we don't have. Where was the Barry Goldwater during the Bush years? Actually, there were a couple. Chuck Hagel was one. People who really stood up and defied. Now, it doesn't mean, some people are reading my book and saying, well, what Tanenhaus wants is for all Republicans to become liberal Democrats. That's not true. What I want them to do is stop acting as if their party is part of a movement. Movements are about crusades. And we need crusades. We've had many great crusades in our history. The abolitionist movement, the suffragist movement, the civil rights movement later, the environmentalist movement, the women's movement. They've all anti-war movements. They've all contributed a great deal to our politics. But a political party really shouldn't become the instrument of a movement. And as I say in the book, what separates conservatism from the conservative movement from all these other movements I've just described is they were social movements that found political outlets. Like if you wanted to end Jim Crow, in the end you had to work through politics to do it. But it didn't begin as a political campaign. Dr. King was a religious man. But politics ended up being the means. But for the conservative movement, politics is really the only vehicle that they use, the only instrument, and their goal, I think, is to attain power. And power is part of what all of us, anyone involved in politics, deals with on a daily basis. But it shouldn't be the ultimate end in itself, simply to attain power. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of post-Goldwater republicanism, that the movement has overrun everything else. Yes, anybody else?
Question.
Yeah. Right here?
First here.
Yes.
I'm a little fuzzy on neoconservatism, particularly some things I've read on Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz. Could you enlighten me and tell me?
Everybody hear that? The gentleman said he's a little fuzzy on neoconservatism. That makes two of us. Anybody else want to join? Okay, here's the basis of what I understand neoconservatism to be. What we saw in the Bush years was the second phase of neoconservatism. The first neoconservatives were liberals, sometimes socialists, who were, in the famous phrase, mugged by reality. People who came out of the left and in the 1960s were really disturbed by some of the facts I mentioned before, particularly what was going on in college campuses, because many of them were academics. And they thought the student revolts were not being contained properly by the administrators, who had abandoned their role as guardians of our society. So they also didn't like the foreign policy of the Democratic Party at that point, because the original liberals of the first Cold War era, people like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., if you know him or know his work, were very strongly anti-communist. And in the 1960s, that anti-communism went away. Anybody remember, by the way, the great early debate in 1992, where I think it was Paul Tsongas said, America didn't win the Cold War, Japan won the Cold War, and then Bill Clinton said, I disagree. The United States won the Cold War. That was a specific appeal to that kind of view of foreign policy. So those are the first neoconservatives, and what they did was they moved away from the Democratic Party. The 1968 election disturbed them, just as it had disturbed Buckley. It seemed like there was anarchy in the streets. So they migrated toward the right, and the first figure they found they really liked was Ronald Reagan, because Reagan in some ways was like them. Remember, Reagan had been a labor leader in Hollywood and was known as kind of a left-winger in the 1930s and 40s, and then had gone to the right. So with Reagan, they saw a political figure who reminded them, actually, of someone like Harry Truman, someone who was very strong in anti-communist foreign policy. So they lined up behind him, and of course you can never leave out the issue of Israel for many, not all, but many neoconservatives, many of whom are Jewish. So Israel became a big issue for them too. Well, then what happened was they were mainly interested in the culture wars in America. And I remember the big culture wars of the 1980s, what books should be taught in college courses. Bill Bennett was a big figure there. Lynn Cheney was actually more famous than Dick Cheney at that point because she was in charge of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And there were all these fights about the culture. What should students read? What should they learn? Was there disrespect for Western values? You know, the big Western values in the upper reaches of American culture. And the most famous book that came out of all that was a book called The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, a professor at the University of Chicago. That's what neoconservatism was about then. After September 11th, it changed form somewhat. It really became about a very aggressive, unipolar foreign policy. You can't, remember the book by Robert Kagan, actually a very intelligent and interesting book called Of Paradise and Power. It had the Mars and Venus theory of foreign policy, that Europeans were from Venus, that is, they were all about love, and Americans from Mars were about war and battle. And so then the neoconservatives became the formulators of the philosophy behind George Bush's foreign policy. That is to say, there was a new threat that resembled the old communist threat. It was radical Islam, the Muslim threat. And so they advocated an approach to solving that would mirror some of the Cold War policies. The most aggressive policies, by the way, which no president had ever followed, from Truman through Eisenhower and Reagan, all the policies that were followed were those of containing communism, not of declaring a kind of military war against it. But the neoconservatives wanted this more aggressive foreign policy, and that's what they became. Look, put yourself in George Bush's shoes after September 11th. You have no clue what to do. The world looks like it's fallen around, come apart all around you. And so you look around the room and you say, who's got an answer? And somebody like Paul Wolfowitz or Rumsfeld or Cheney, who'd been calling for a kind of new Cold War since the early 90s. See, that group feared that once the communist threat went away, some other threat would emerge. And you could make the case that ideologically they were right. Now, there's a huge difference between a loose federation of radical Islamic groups and Moscow Central, one of the biggest nations in the world. That was a miscalculation they made because they were so enamored with this earlier idea of a Cold War enemy. But when Bush needs advice, these are the people who seem to have it. They have a worldview to give him. America is at war. We're being attacked by these infidels, these people who hate us, who hate our democracy, who hate modern life and society, some of which is true. And so they came up with a game plan for him to show them that we're not as weak as you think we are. And so they chose Iraq, which had been on the agenda for a long time. Remember, they were never able to establish a connection between Iraq and September 11th, though they tried. And so that's what they became the formulators of that foreign policy, of George Bush's foreign policy. That's what the neoconservatives historically, in political terms, will probably be most important. I don't know if that helps at all. Hope so.
Question.
Yeah.
You're right there.
1988, George H.W. Bush says, quote, "Read my lips, no new taxes," end quote. Late 1990, he signs a tax increase into law. Why didn't he? I've never gotten a straight answer to this question, so I'll try you. Why didn't Bush the elder realize if he broke his word to his constituency, he would lose his job?
Well, because, it's a funny thing about George Bush. The great columnist William Safire, now retired, once said, everybody gets George Bush wrong. He said, George Bush was not the genius of foreign policy. He was actually pretty bad on foreign policy. He was much better on the economy. He kind of saw what needed to be done or didn't need to be done. I think Bush, to his credit now, I would say the problem there was making the pledge about taxes. He shouldn't have said that in the first place. I think he did what he thought he needed to do in this pragmatic way. Why did Ronald, in other words, taxes probably needed to be raised. That's what his economic advisors were telling him. And his job is when he has advisors he respects who tell him the economy needs it, he probably has to do it. Now, you may quarrel with that in ideological grounds, but see, that's why I say we want to make a distinction between principle on the one hand and sort of ideologically harnessing yourself to it on the other. The real problem was that Bush, who had already been badly challenged, badly damaged by Patrick Buchanan, if anybody remembers the primary, in '92, already saw himself on the run, and so by the time he was running for president, he was finished. In '88, he made that statement because much of the Republican Party hadn't wanted him as their candidate. Remember, he was the author of the phrase voodoo economics that during the 1980 primaries that had alienated so much of the right. So really what, in my analysis, and it's not to say it's good or bad, just to try to understand it in historical terms, I think what Bush was doing in 1988 was trying to reassure Republican voters who were skeptical about him that he was on board. And I think that's why he said that. Then what he thought he could do, one thing that makes Bush the last of the old-style presidents in some way was he had one team who ran his campaign, and then he wouldn't let them in the front door of the White House. He had another team that actually guided his policy, because he was kind of a patrician, and that's how we thought you did it. That you have the dirty guys come in to help you get elected, and then you don't get your fingers dirty by inviting them to dinner. Now, we don't see that with presidents anymore. They tend to merge the two. But I think George Bush actually, in a way, didn't really initially take seriously that pledge he'd made. In a way, he disrespected his own voters by saying it in the first place, because he thought, I'll say that to get myself elected, then I won't worry about what happens next. So that probably is what undid him.
Next question. You right there in the blue shirt. Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
At least for those of us who didn't live through the 60s, the current political environment is, the most contentious, the most acerbic that we've witnessed. Even Speaker Pelosi in the last couple of days has spoken of the kind of bubbling danger of violence. Can you lend some perspective? I mean, is paranoia justified today, or are we just in another swing of contentious times?
It's a really tough question. An essay I was recommending to Dean Rutherford and some other people, I recommend to all of you. It's a famous essay by Richard Hofstadter, published in the 1960s, called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And what it's about, it's important he uses the word style. Many on the right say, well, here's a liberal who's saying all conservatives are paranoids. That's not what he said. He said that there's a style of politics we have that resembles paranoia because it's very conspiratorial. And I think, again, we were talking about this at lunch, one of the big surprises for me was, remember that moment when President Obama was elected, when it seemed universally as a nation, there was tremendous pride. George Bush made a comment about it. Even on Fox News, they were saying, this is a historic moment. And somehow, very quickly, that evaporated. And I think the surprise is that emotions we thought maybe had gone away never really did. And I guess that's one of the lessons of modern politics. What this moment reminds me of, if you want some historical perspective on it, is the very early 1960s. I hate to come back to that decade, but it's when so much changed. Anybody remember the John Birch Society? Some people here must. Okay, John Birch Society was an extremely reactionary organization founded by a man, actually, who came from Massachusetts, Belmont, Massachusetts, where lived Robert Welch, who had worked out a theory that established that the two principal communist agents in America were Dwight Eisenhower and his brother Milton. And the organization was founded in 1958. It was the year after Joseph McCarthy had died. And it was named for a soldier, an American soldier, who had died on the Chinese border and therefore was the first victim of the Cold War. And so Welch formed this very well-organized outfit that had some 60,000 members in the early 1960s and looked like it would grow bigger. They were all over the country. They were here, I assume. They were very big in California, big in New York, places you might not expect. And people would meet in living rooms and get literature explaining the communist menace and how likely the PTA in your own school was being controlled by the Kremlin, though you might not know it. Here's some of the ways you can tell if your kids are being indoctrinated by a communist, this sort of thing. And there was great fascination with it among the media. The media made it bigger and bigger. I've been doing research on this recently, and my publication, the New York Times, was writing about the John Birch Society constantly and probably making it seem bigger than it really was. But the conspiratorial politics that grew out of it fascinated Richard Hofstadter. So he went back and he looked historically, and he saw that even back at the time of the founding of this great republic, there was a fear of conspiracy. After all, we're a nation that was founded in repudiation of a government, the government in England. So there's always been a kind of anti-government strain in our history. And it surfaces at various times. The reason this moment now reminds us of the early 1960s is then, too, we'd elected a president who came from a background unlike any of his predecessors. He was a Roman Catholic, John F. Kennedy. Second, very wealthy. And at that time, it was still widely believed, including by authors and journalists, that any Roman Catholic would answer to the Vatican before he answered to the Constitution. In fact, Kennedy had to give his most famous campaign speech assuring the public that he would govern as an American and not as a foot soldier of Rome. It was a famous speech he gave in Houston, I think. Well, Kennedy was charismatic. He won a very close election. We sometimes forget how close that election was. He won by about 100,000 votes. And there were rumors, some of them convincing, that it had not been a fair election. Some of it, there might have been precincts that had been stolen in Chicago and Illinois, which turned out to be the key state. So Kennedy, like Obama, entered the White House as a kind of charismatic, attractive, new outsider, somebody very different. And so the nature of the attacks on him and his administration also had this conspiratorial quality to them. Kennedy, also like Obama, surrounded himself with Harvard professors, people who come from sort of the intellectual and governing establishment. So if you're inclined to look at the presidency in particular as a kind of beachhead for an alien politics, where outsiders who aren't like other Americans are calling the shots, then these guys make pretty good test cases for that. They can inspire and provoke reactions like that. Let's not forget how much of this kind of paranoia there was when President Clinton was in office. Remember, that's when the militias came back, the Minutemen, Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City. I mean, it really did seem like a moment in some ways much more violent. We haven't seen any violence yet, thank God. But there were very intense passions there, too. And that is the part of conservatism I call revanchism, which I wish the Republican Party and the conservative elite, the thinkers and journalists and such, would just denounce and get rid of. Another important thing William Buckley did, I come back to him all the time because he was so ideological yet saw the lay of the land. In 1965, after the Birchers had helped Goldwater get the nomination in California, in other words, they'd been very useful foot soldiers for movement conservatism, Buckley decided they'd gone too far. And so he devoted 14 pages in his magazine, National Review, to a very meticulous critique and dismantling of all the craziness within the John Birch Society. And he did something else. I saw this when I went through his archives, because I'm writing his biography. He sent a letter to Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, and Senator John Tower, three of the leading ideological conservatives of the day. And he said, the deed is done. You'll see you'll see what I am doing in attacking reading the John Birch Society out of the movement. John Tower stood on the floor of the Senate and read Buckley's columns denouncing Robert Welch and the John Birch Society into the congressional record to show that the intellectuals here and the political leaders here were united in expunging the extremists. What's worrisome now is not just that you hear extremist views. We'll always hear extremist views. There are 300 million people in this country. You're going to hear a very wide range of views. It is the credence they're being given by people who should know better. That's what's alarming. One is waiting for the serious-minded conservative to come forward the way William Buckley did and said, here's where we draw the line. You don't call a president you disagree with a communist or a socialist. You know, this kind of thing, which we don't see in our politics now. So that's what concerns me. But I don't see us being on the brink of some apocalyptic, terrible moment. It's ugly, it's unpleasant. You know what, though? It's better to have it out in the open than in secret. One advance we've made is that now it all happens openly. Back in the days of the John Birch Society, journalists couldn't ever attend their meetings except under false pretenses. They had to pretend to join the society. The reason is that the Birch Society very directly modeled itself on the communist conspiracy. They wanted to be counter-communists. So they were secret. They created a secret network. Now at least it's all out in the open. You can go on the internet and see Dick Armey's website. All this stuff is there for you to see. And I think that's actually a huge advantage. And even an act like Congressman Wilson saying something, you know, it really does kind of dishonor his own institution, and that's why he's rebuked. And the president does all this. We see it. It's not done secretly. It's there for us to see and think about. And I think that's the most important thing. That's how the democracy works. The more transparency, the better. But transparency also means you'll see things you wish you didn't have to see. But I think we all have to look at them anyway.